Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a slow, meandering stroll through one of the most elusive and mysterious corners of the world, the Amazon rainforest. I mean, it's lush, it's tropical, it's pretty much the epitome of don't go in there alone, but the real question is, whatever happened to the civilizations that once thrived there? You know, the ones that definitely weren't just out hunting jaguars and eating raw fruit all day. No, these were full-blown societies with cities, trade, and definitely some questionable fashion choices. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, and let's wander through history, where things didn't always go according to plan for the indigenous civilizations of the Amazon. Okay, now to really start, you've got to know one thing. The Amazon has a huge reputation. It's this wild, mysterious, almost mythical place. A jungle so dense it makes your cousin's hair look well-groomed by comparison. Explorers and scientists have been stumbling through the Amazon for centuries, and many of them came back with that look, like, you know, the one where they just kind of sit in a chair rocking back and forth, murmuring about lost cities and ancient ruins. But for all that drama, we haven't really cracked the case of what happened to the civilizations that once lived here. The Amazon, contrary to what many of us probably think, wasn't some untouched, pristine wilderness until Europeans stumbled across it. Oh no, it was very much occupied. In fact, it had thriving civilizations long before the New World was even a twinkle in Columbus's eye. These societies didn't just randomly spring up and die overnight. They had complex systems in place, with large-scale farming, trade networks, and architecture that would have made your local urban planners jealous. Now, here's where it gets interesting, or should I say tragic, because despite all the progress, the story of these civilizations is not one of success and prosperity. Nope, it's a tale of decay, abandonment, and a jungle that just doesn't like to give up its secret. One of the main players in this saga is something called the Terra Preta, or Black Earth. Imagine this, a soil so rich, so nutrient-packed, it could basically grow crops just by looking at them. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, Terra Preta is what these ancient societies were using to cultivate the Amazon. But it wasn't some random stroke of luck. Oh no, the people who lived here knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just plant a few crops and pray for rain. They engineered the soil to be perfect for farming, turning what could have been a hostile environment into a giant, sustainable farm. If you're wondering how they did it, it wasn't magic, though it's almost as cool. They mixed charcoal, bone, and pottery shards into the soil, kind of like a weird ancient compost. This made the earth rich in nutrients and perfect for growing things like manioc, corn, and various fruit trees. It's like they had their own prehistoric version of Miracle-Gro. So while the Europeans were out there fighting with the weather in Europe, these Amazon civilizations were living the good life, surrounded by what seemed like endless food. But here's where the plot thickens. And of course it involves Europeans in the 1500s. When the Portuguese and Spanish began arriving in South America, they brought their signature charm, read, diseases, and the occasional genocidal tendencies. These civilizations, which were thriving in a pretty sustainable way, didn't stand a chance. There's no exact timeline for what happened next. But the arrival of diseases like smallpox, influenza, and malaria, diseases to which the Amazon's indigenous populations had no immunity, wiped out entire tribes. As the population dropped, the once thriving cities and agricultural systems crumbled. The people who lived here were either killed off, forcibly moved, or driven into hiding by the devastation. And that, my friends, is where the big mystery begins. Because while we've known about these societies for a while, the details are scattered like a half-completed jigsaw puzzle left in the rain. As the cities fell, the jungle took over. Trees and vines wrapped themselves around ruins, and the once mighty civilizations were forgotten, buried under layers of green, like the world's largest, slowest game of hide and seek. And sure, there have been attempts to find out what happened, especially in the 20th century when some daring and, let's be real, slightly mad explorers started using aerial surveys and satellite imagery to map out what's left. You see, the Amazon is so dense, so incredibly thick, that it's hard to see anything through the canopy. You can walk for days and still not see the full extent of the civilization that existed beneath you. But with modern technology, things started to change. Aerial photography and laser scanning. Yes, laser scanning have revealed things that we once thought were lost forever. One of the most fascinating discoveries was in the late 20th century, when researchers used LiDAR, light detection and ranging technology, to map out huge areas of the Amazon. What did they find? Well, it turns out the Amazon wasn't just a few scattered villages and hunter-gatherers. No, it was home to a network of interconnected cities, vast agricultural systems, and trade routes. These weren't just a couple of huts thrown together by some people who wanted to live dangerously. No, these were urban centres with roads, bridges and plazas, all carefully planned out. In fact, some of the biggest surprises came from mapping the lowland areas of the Amazon. You see, we used to think that the people who lived in the Amazon didn't build massive structures because it was just too wet or inhospitable for large-scale construction. But the more we look, the more we realise how wrong we were. These people built monumental things, and they did it in a way that could have stood the test of time if it hadn't been for that whole getting wiped out by European diseases problem. But just when you think this might end on a happy note, spoiler alert, it doesn't. Because as much as we've uncovered, there's still so much more we don't know. Whole cities are still hidden beneath the canopy. And while we can piece together some of the fragments, the true extent of what was once there is still a mystery. The jungle has a way of keeping its secrets, and in some ways that's kind of poetic. Maybe these civilizations are meant to remain lost, tucked away under layers of roots and leaves, like the forgotten stories of a world that once was. So what happened to these ancient Amazon civilizations? Well, they were crushed by disease, abandoned by their people, and ultimately swallowed by the unforgiving forest. But what remains is this: proof that these people were far from primitive. They had a level of agricultural and urban sophistication that many of us still don't fully appreciate. They weren't just living in the jungle, they were shaping it to fit their needs. And in the end, the jungle, being the eternal survivor it is, got the last laugh. So by the time the European explorers started wandering through the Amazon in the 16th century, most of the civilization there was already well gone. But that doesn't mean it was completely wiped out. Oh, no. The evidence was still there, if you knew where to look. Archaeologists have recently uncovered clues that reveal entire networks of cities scattered across the rainforest floor, with complex systems of roads and settlements that were carefully planned out. Sort of like an ancient version of your neighbourhood, except with fewer lawnmowers and more mosquitoes. And let's be honest here for a second, it wasn't all this mystical, hidden treasure stuff that got us interested in these lost civilizations. No, it was the actual scale of what was. A lot of the early explorers didn't give much thought to the possibility that the Amazon wasn't some impassable wilderness, but actually a place where people built things. They had that whole it's just jungle mentality, which, spoiler alert, was completely wrong. There were and still are traces of massive cities that are so dense they could rival modern urban centres in terms of layout and organisation. But of course all that fell apart because of, you guessed it, those pesky European diseases. Think about it. You've got these advanced civilizations going about their business, living off terra preta, thriving in this incredibly efficient, self-sustaining system, and then boom, smallpox. Literally wiped them out. Talk about an unsportsmanlike move. One day you're harvesting manioc, and the next thing you know, half your population is gone. No wonder they didn't leave behind a nice "I survived the plague" t-shirt. Now let's chat about the discoveries that have emerged more recently. Thanks to modern technology, we've been able to glimpse what lay beneath the surface of this great green blanket. We've already touched on LiDAR, because who doesn't love laser beams? The images taken from the air have revealed the layout of ancient cities and settlements, and we've learned that these civilizations weren't just isolated little groups. No, they had entire networks, much like the urban sprawl you find in, well, anywhere with a bustling metropolis. These roads and settlements stretch out in ways we never thought possible, One of the key discoveries involves a series of geometric earthworks, basically giant, perfectly shaped mounds and structures that still dot the Amazon today. These earthworks have been found in places like the Upper Singa region in Brazil, which, when you think about it, is sort of like discovering an ancient version of those crazy backyard gardens people create with too much time on their hands, except with way more effort and probably less garden gnomes. These mounds and formations suggest that these societies didn't just build haphazardly. They had a plan, a really good one too. And that brings us to the mystery of why the civilizations collapsed in the first place. Was it all about disease? Well, mostly yes, but there are other theories. Some historians believe that the collapse could have been caused by the overexploitation of the land. You see, the ancient civilizations were really good at farming, but the Amazon is a delicate ecosystem. Too much deforestation, too much farming, and things could get out of balance. It's like trying to grow a perfect garden in your backyard, but you keep eating the tomatoes before they're ripe. Eventually the soil wears out and your garden just can't produce anymore. And let's not forget about the constant wars. The Amazon wasn't all peaceful farmer communities. Oh no, there were conflicts, skirmishes and territorial battles between different tribes and groups. So between disease, environmental damage and the usual political instability that comes with human nature, these civilizations, though brilliant in many ways, couldn't keep it together for long. Which is honestly just kind of tragic when you think about it. They were so close, and yet so... As we explore more of these discoveries, we see evidence that these cities weren't just designed for function, they were crafted to blend with the natural world around them. Imagine a city that's so perfectly integrated with its environment that it doesn't feel like it was built, it feels like it grew there. Roads were often made of elevated wooden walkways, meaning they didn't have to disturb the fragile forest floor. And the houses? Oh, they were made to adapt. They weren't some rigid cookie-cutter buildings. These people built their homes using local materials and were, by all accounts, incredibly resourceful. But like everything in history, the Amazon's greatest civilizations didn't last. The reasons for their downfall are still a bit of a cocktail of theories. Disease, resource depletion, warfare, and the unstoppable force of time. Some of these societies managed to hang on for a little while, but ultimately the jungle claimed them. One by one, cities were abandoned, their once thriving streets now overrun with vines and trees. And that, my dear listeners, is where we find ourselves today, gazing at the remnants of what once was, while the forest keeps its secret. First off, we can't ignore one of the major reasons these civilizations flourished in the Amazon in the first place: the terra preta. Remember how we mentioned this magical soil earlier? Well, let's dive into why it's so important. Terra preta was a game changer for ancient Amazonian farmers. It wasn't just a happy accident. The creation of terra preta required deep knowledge of organic materials and an understanding of soil science that would impress any modern-day farmer or gardener. This soil was the result of a mix of charcoal, ash, bone and pottery shards, creating a fertile environment perfect for agriculture. It's like they had their own pre-industrial version of composting. And it worked. This kind of nutrient-rich soil allowed these civilizations to grow crops year-round, feeding thousands of people and providing the necessary surplus for trade and growth. Imagine farming in a place that should be too hostile for farming and doing it so well that you create a self-sustaining long-term system. And what crops did they grow, you ask? Well, they didn't just throw random seeds into the ground and hope for the best. No. These civilizations grew manioc, a root that's great for making flour, sweet potatoes, corn, and a variety of fruits like bananas and guavas. These societies weren't subsistence farming, hoping for a decent crop each season. They were producing so much food that they were able to support large, complex communities. And they were able to trade, which meant they were part of an even bigger network of people across the region. Now let's chat about one of the more fascinating aspects of these lost cities: their roads. You'd think that roads would be a relatively basic thing for a civilization, right? But these people didn't just toss together some mud paths and call it a day. No, they built sophisticated road systems that spanned hundreds of kilometers. The roads connected towns and cities, forming vast trade routes that linked different groups. Some roads were raised, while others were built through the dense forest, meaning they were well designed for the specific environment they were in. These weren't just functional, they were smart, built with the unique characteristics of the Amazon in mind. And yes, we're still talking about roads in a jungle, roads in the Amazon. That's how serious these civilizations were about getting their goods from point A to point B. These trade networks helped not only with transporting food and goods, but they also allowed these groups to exchange ideas and culture. So while the early European explorers were busy sailing into the unknown, these Amazonian civilizations were deep into their own version of urban planning and economic development. It wasn't just about the roads. One of the truly mind-blowing discoveries made over the years was the evidence of large open spaces, plazas, and what can only be described as urban layouts. These cities weren't just scattered settlements thrown together without any thought. They were designed to be lived in. We're talking about cities where the architecture reflected a deep understanding of the environment, and they were built for longevity. These were places that could support populations of thousands, if not tens of thousands. And you might be asking, but if they were so advanced, how did they just disappear? Well, dear listener, that's the tragic part. Despite their sophistication, their systems were fragile. As we touched on before, the arrival of European diseases decimated their populations. But it wasn't just disease that did them in. Over time, the increasing population put pressure on the land. The very systems that had once helped them thrive now began to erode. Deforestation and soil depletion, no matter how advanced their farming methods were, started taking a toll. There was too much demand on the land's resources, and the balance they had carefully nurtured for centuries started to break down. And then, of course, there's the simple but brutal reality that no one could have foreseen. The jungle, as it always does, just reclaimed everything. The dense vegetation and sprawling vines eventually swallowed the remnants of these cities whole. Over time, the memory of these civilizations faded, and the people scattered or died off. Still, every now and then someone comes along, often armed with a drone or a satellite image, and says, "Oh hey, look, there's a giant city right under that tree." But by the time they find it, much of the story is lost. Archaeologists have uncovered parts of these cities, roads, squares, and agricultural terraces, but we're still missing so many key pieces. The true scale of these Amazonian civilizations is still a puzzle, and it's one that likely won't be fully solved in our lifetimes. Every new discovery gives us more questions than answers. What did their religious practices look like? What were their governing systems like? What led to their downfall? It's frustrating, honestly. We're piecing together the scattered remnants of an incredibly complex civilization, but it's also fragmented. And just when you think you've got a grasp on the story, the jungle goes and hides more ruins beneath a pile of leaves and dirt. And what's even more fascinating is that some of these ancient civilizations were not the peaceful farming utopias we sometimes imagine. While they were building their cities and farming the land, they were also likely engaging in warfare with neighbouring groups. Territorial disputes, raiding, and the usual human conflicts took place. There wasn't just one big happy family living in harmony with nature. In fact, some of the roads that have been uncovered seem to have been built for military purposes. Who knows how many battles were fought on the land where we now find ourselves standing, staring at the mysterious remains of their cities. So why do we keep coming back to this? Why do we care about these lost cities in the first place? It's not just because we love a good mystery, though let's be real, we do. It's because they remind us that the past is far more complex, and often more advanced than we give it credit for. These people were innovators in their own right. They were architects, urban planners, and engineers, long before the Industrial Revolution. So as we've mentioned a few times, it wasn't until the late 20th century that we started realizing just how much of this ancient history was hiding under the trees. Sure, explorers had heard whispers of large cities or rumoured ruin, but it wasn't until the 1990s when remote sensing technology like LiDAR, light detection and ranging came into play that things really started to get interesting. Before that, archaeology was very much a let's hack our way through the jungle and hope we find something cool situation. But LiDAR gave us a whole new way to look at the world. It uses lasers to map the ground beneath dense vegetation, allowing us to see structures buried under a thick canopy of trees without actually disturbing the land. Kind of like X-ray vision for the Earth, but much, much more scientific, and that's how in recent years, researchers have started to uncover what can only be described as an urban landscape beneath the jungle floor. They've found huge networks of roads, plazas, and even sophisticated water management systems. Things we never thought possible for a civilization that supposedly lived in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. It turns out that the Amazon wasn't just a wilderness. It was a well-designed, thriving, complex landscape. These ancient people weren't just surviving, they were managing their environment in ways we're still trying to understand. Now let's take a little detour into a discovery that blew everyone's minds in 2018. That's when a team of archaeologists and scientists, using LiDAR, mapped out over 60,000 previously unknown structures in Guatemala's jungle. Yep, you read that right. 60,000 structures. They uncovered vast, sprawling cities, complete with pyramids, temples, and causeways. And this was just in one part of the Maya civilization, not even the Amazon proper. But what does this tell us? Well, it shows that even when we think we know what's out there, the reality is that there's still so much hidden beneath the surface. These ancient people were seriously good at keeping their secrets. But it wasn't just Guatemala that benefited from this technology. The Brazilian Amazon, with all its thick vegetation, has been yielding its own treasures. Using the same LiDAR technology, scientists have uncovered massive networks of roads, as well as elaborate building complexes that suggest the presence of large, organized societies. And remember, these were not small villages, these were cities with planned layouts, much like the ancient Roman roads that crisscrossed Europe. Let's take a minute to appreciate the scale of what's being uncovered. Imagine walking into the jungle today and stumbling upon a perfect grid of streets, all paved with cobblestones. You might think you've just stepped into an Indiana Jones movie. But no, these were real civilizations, serious, organized groups of people who lived, worked, and thrived here. They didn't just happen upon a good patch of land and hope for the best. They created systems, and some of those systems are just now starting to see the light of day. But here's the kicker. Despite all these new discoveries, we still don't know exactly who built these cities or how they lived day to day. Was it one dominant civilization, or were there multiple separate groups coexisting and exchanging ideas? How did they manage their water resources? How did they deal with natural disasters like flooding and drought? These are all questions that remain, frustratingly, unanswered. There are theories, of course. Some suggest that the civilizations may have been interconnected by trade and cultural exchange. Others point to environmental factors that may have caused certain cities to rise or fall. As we uncover more and more of these hidden cities, we're also uncovering something else. The truth about the Amazon itself. Contrary to the traditional view of the rainforest as an untouched wilderness, we're now starting to realize that this landscape was anything but wild. It was shaped and molded by human hands for thousands of years. And in some ways, that makes it all the more heartbreaking. These civilizations had figured out ways to thrive in an environment that to most of us would seem impossible. They lived in harmony with the land, cultivating it in ways that allowed them to survive for centuries. And yet, just as they reached their peak, everything started to fall apart. Why? Well, as we've touched on before, it wasn't just the diseases brought by Europeans. Environmental damage played a huge role too. It's believed that over time, the increasing demand on the land's resources, whether it was for food, building materials, or agricultural land, may have led to the collapse of these societies. And of course, there was the added strain of warfare between competing groups, which likely further destabilized things. It's like watching a house of cards slowly collapse one piece at a time. And yet, despite all that, the resilience of these ancient people still shines through. They managed to build something lasting, something that we're only beginning to understand. It's not just the roads and cities that remain, it's the knowledge and ingenuity they left to Pi. If we can unlock even a fraction of their secrets, we'll have a much deeper understanding of what it really means to live in the Amazon. You see, the more we uncover about these ancient societies, the clearer it becomes that they weren't just a flash in the pan. They didn't build for a generation or two and then just vanish. No, these civilizations had an influence that rippled through the region, one that's still being felt today, in ways we're only starting to understand. Take, for example, the way these civilizations interacted with the landscape. We know they were masters at cultivating the soil, but they also had an incredibly complex understanding of their environment. They didn't just clear land and plant crops. They worked with the land. They shaped it in ways that allowed them to grow food, sustain populations, and thrive without decimating the environment around them. This wasn't just plant a few seeds and hope for rain stuff. This was long-term strategic farming. And how do we know this? Well, it's all thanks to that magical terra preta we've mentioned a few times. This soil was a product of centuries of knowledge and experience passed down through generations. They learned how to turn what could have been a hostile environment into a fertile ground for growth. But even today, terra preta remains one of the best examples of ancient ecological ingenuity. Modern scientists and agricultural experts are still studying it, hoping to replicate the process and improve the sustainability of farming in other parts of the world. In other words, the legacy of these ancient Amazonian civilizations is still influencing the way we think about agriculture and the environment today. Who knew? And then there's the matter of the roads. Yes, those ancient, buried roadways. What's fascinating about these roads is not just their function in connecting cities, but how they also served as vital pathways for the exchange of ideas, culture, and goods. These weren't just some crude dirt track. They were engineered, designed to withstand the jungle's humidity, floods, and the overgrowth that's so characteristic of the Amazon. These roads show us that the people living in the Amazon had sophisticated understanding not only of urban planning, but of logistics and trade. Now, this isn't just a wow, look at those smart ancient people moment. These roads, especially those linked to trade routes, helped create a kind of cultural melting pot. As civilizations spread and connected with others, they traded not just physical goods, but also knowledge, and this exchange wasn't just some casual barter of crops. We're talking about trading ideas on farming, architecture, medicine, and perhaps even the very nature of what it meant to live in harmony with the environment. The evidence of trade and cultural exchange shows that these societies were not isolated. They were part of a vast, interconnected network. This trade also likely had an impact on the types of crops these civilizations cultivated. It wasn't just about feeding themselves, they were part of a larger network that stretched across the continent. It's quite possible that the plants we associate with the Amazon, like the mighty cacao tree, the one that gives us chocolate, were once cultivated and spread by these ancient civilizations. While the cacao plant is often linked to the Maya or Aztec, the roots of its cultivation may trace back further to the very people who lived in the Amazon. And speaking of plants, let's take a moment to talk about the plants these civilizations domesticate. These ancient people didn't just pick fruit off trees and call it a day. They were manipulating the environment to grow the food they wanted. Many of the crops that were central to their diets, like cassava, manioc, sweet potatoes, and various fruits, were likely bred and domesticated by these very people. So when you dig up the history of food production in the Amazon, you're also unearthing a piece of this civilization's legacy. We often think of indigenous peoples as simple, nature-bound people, but the reality is that these societies were anything but. They were advanced, strategic, and creative in their approach to agriculture. It's almost poetic, really. These civilizations were living so sustainably, in tune with nature, and yet they were brought to the brink of collapse by forces they couldn't control, disease, over-exploitation, and of course the relentless encroachment of the jungle. And yet, despite their downfall, their imprint on the land remains, invisible to most, but still there. The roads, the fields, the terraces, they're all evidence of a deeply rooted culture that understood the land like no one else. Now there's one final aspect of their legacy, that's still echoing through time today. The indigenous tribes who remain in the Amazon today, while very different in many ways from the ancient civilizations, still carry the knowledge passed down by their ancestors. The practices of sustainable farming, forest management, and resource conservation are deeply ingrained in many of these tribes. So while these ancient societies may have disappeared, their legacy still exists in the very people who inhabit the Amazon today. It's a bittersweet thought, isn't it, that these ancient civilizations, though lost to time, didn't just disappear, they evolved into something new. The people of the Amazon are still here, still living, still practicing many of the skills and ways of life that helped their ancestors survive for centuries. In some ways, their civilizations never really left. They simply adapted and evolved with the times. So what's the takeaway here? Well, it's that the Amazon's lost civilizations weren't just footnotes in history. They weren't some distant romanticized past. They were vibrant, complex societies that shaped the world around them, and their influence is still felt today. As we continue to study their remnants, we're reminded that history doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's a web of interconnected stories, legacies, and cultures that reach far beyond the pages of textbooks. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, the next big discovery is waiting just beneath the surface, hidden under a few more layers of leaves and vines. Maybe in a few years we'll have more pieces to the puzzle, and the story will be even more complex than we imagined. But until then, we'll just keep wandering through the jungle, piece by piece, uncovering the past in a world that's still holding on to its secret. Well, here's where it gets both hopeful and a little ominous, because the truth is, there's still so much left to discover in the Amazon, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the future of Amazonian archaeology is incredibly exciting. With new technologies, from drones to LiDAR, we're getting more detailed maps of this dense jungle than ever before. The jungle is like a great big puzzle, and we're slowly fitting the pieces together. The more we uncover, the clearer it becomes that these ancient civilizations were far more advanced than we ever gave them credit for. But on the other hand, the Amazon itself is changing fast, and that makes it a race against time to preserve what's left before it's lost forever. The Amazon is facing some very real threats right now. Climate change, deforestation, illegal mining, and agriculture are rapidly changing the landscape. Every year, a little more of the forest disappears, and with it, any remnants of ancient civilization. Some of these sites are already being damaged, if not outright destroyed, as logging and farming continue to encroach on the jungle. The same places we're trying to study are being wiped off the map in the name of economic progress, and that means that the window to uncover these hidden cities is closing fast. In some ways, it's like watching a movie where you know the ending is coming, but you're powerless to stop it. It's frustrating because for all the technological advances, there's still no substitute for the preservation of what's left. The most important thing now is balancing the need for conservation with the need for discovery, because ultimately, as much as we want to uncover the lost cities, we also want to protect them so that future generations can learn from them too. Now, before we totally deflate the mood, let's acknowledge something beautiful in all of this, the effort that's being made to keep the Amazon alive. Indigenous groups, environmental organizations, and researchers are working together to protect the region with a renewed focus on sustainable practices. These are the same people who, in many cases, are still living with the knowledge passed down from those very ancient civilizations we've been studying. They have a deep, intimate understanding of the land, and their efforts to conserve the Amazon are helping ensure that the region continues to thrive, not just for the next decade or century, but for the next millennium. It's not just about finding ruins and unlocking ancient secrets anymore. It's about protecting the very ecosystem that allowed these civilizations to flourish in the first place. In a way, the preservation of the Amazon is a tribute to the legacy of those lost civilizations. By saving the jungle, we're saving the very roots of human ingenuity and the ability to live in harmony with nature. So as we wind down, it's not just the archaeology that matters, it's the jungle itself. We can keep uncovering, but we also need to respect what's been left behind. The Amazon, like these ancient civilizations, is a story of survival, of adaptation, and of resilience. It's a story that doesn't have a neat, happy ending. It's ongoing, messy, and constantly changing. But that's what makes it so compelling. The jungle is both a protector of the past and a constant reminder of the fragility of human history. But don't be fooled into thinking the story of the Amazon has been told completely. Oh no, not by a long shot. The jungle is still holding its cards close to its chest, and as much as we'd like to think we've figured it all out, there's still so much more to uncover. Who knows, maybe the greatest discovery is still lying under a blanket of vines, just waiting for the right person to find. Maybe it's a city, maybe it's a forgotten manuscript, or maybe it's just another mystery that will keep us wandering through the jungle forever, with no real answers in sight. But hey, that's the beauty of history, right? It's messy, it's complex, and sometimes you just have to sit back and enjoy the ride. The lost civilizations of the Amazon might not have left us their treasure chests, but they did leave us something far more valuable: their legacy, their ingenuity, and their undying connection to the land they once shaped. And if we're lucky, maybe, just maybe, we'll continue to discover just how deep that connection truly goes. And with that, let's drift gently into another curious chapter of history.